Ego. You know what we say in America, never leave home without it. The arch enemy of Indian independence, but an eloquent and charismatic leader of World War II, Winston Churchill, once said of Americans, he said, Americans try to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. So it sounds a lot like you and me, actually. So ego gets a lot of brickbats in spiritual teachings and with spiritual teachers, but we do never leave home without it. When you study the lives of great saints and masters, you get a clearer picture for what's involved. Here in the reading at the quote from the Gita about the qualities of nature are such that whether the qualities are inertial in creating substance or whether they're energetic or uplifting, this is the nature of what we experience in the world. And it's very hard to transcend those influences. We need to eat, for example. Maybe we're attracted to a privileged life, or we'd like to have a privilege, whatever it might be. These qualities, these attractions and repulsions are warp and woof with what we experience. And so even a saint or a master has ego. Yogananda described the ego as the soul to the extent identified with the body. And of course the body symbolizes all of its functions as well as our personality and so forth. So even though there is sometimes talk of destroying the ego and so forth, it's not really the deeper truth. You know, I guess it's theologies of different religions, the question has come up, well, when one achieves salvation, whatever that is, what happens to the ego? Well, in Christianity, the ego, you even get your physical body back. Even if you got cremated or destroyed, somehow all these atoms coalesce at the judgment day and you get your body back, oh boy, and you get to strum harps for eternity, oh boy. And so, that's one way of looking at it. Sounds kind of boring. But even in India, there are those who say the I-thou relationship continues into eternity, more or less the same idea. And then you have some of the Buddhists who say, well, poof, you're gone. You're nothing. It reminds me of that joke I say every year about the guy who said I was nothing. And so the minister runs up to the altar and throws himself on the altar saying, I am nothing, I am nothing. And I'll cut the short joke since you've heard it a million times. And then the janitor runs up, inspired by that, throws himself on the altar and says, I am nothing, I am nothing. The priest looks at him and says, look who thinks he's nothing. So, there's just no way, there's no getting around it. And so the real solution to the omnipresence of the ego, which really stated more deeply perhaps, is the fact that the only reality there is at all is consciousness. The entire purpose, from a divine standpoint, for this creation is that the creation can, by degrees and in various forms and so forth, acquire some degree of it, some degree of intelligence, later acquire some degree of self-awareness, and then eventually, armed as we are in the design of the human body, to awaken and transcend these influences of this world, the gunas as they're called in Sanskrit, and transcend those to awaken to the reality that consciousness is the only thing there is. This is the entire purpose. So it's not about declaiming the ego, it's about purifying, refining, expanding the sense of self-identity from the body to something greater. As a grandparent, and like many grandparents, you have the opportunity to observe parenting, for one thing, and child growth for another. And that reminds me of another joke. Some famous person whose name I forgot once said about Americans that Americans, they're great parents. They obey their children. So that's sort of what it really is these days. But anyway, where was I? So when you observe, in the last many years of Padma and I being involved with our grandchildren, it was really interesting to me, something I hadn't noticed with our children so much. But the little infant, you look in the eyes of an infant and you see spirit. There's no distinction happening. It's on some maybe deeper level, not always when their diapers are wet, but on some deeper level, they're in bliss. They're just like this, right? And yet what I noticed is within probably the first year of life, something begins to happen and they get attached. So that if mom, like our daughter Gita, if she offered me the kid, the kid would start screaming and it would want mommy. It's like, hey, what's wrong with me? So the whole process by which we grow, the little infant, toddler has to learn to control his bodily functions and learn to walk without falling down and skinning his knees. And so we know as we go through life. What I observed is that you have to have an ego. You can't give away. You can't offer yourself to something greater unless you own it. You must become self-possessed in order to be, at some point, self-transcendent. It's the law of life. And so it is we go through the different stages of life, teenager. I often say the reason I want to be free in this lifetime is so I don't have to be a teenager again. But, we all have our little motivations that way. The intensity of self-consciousness and all that teenagers go through. And so we see that in the archetypal experience of human life, you go through that phase and then you become what they call an adult. I'm still waiting, but anyway, you become an adult and then maybe in traditional situations, you get married, you have children. Well, the children are your opportunity to expand your sense of self beyond your own little world, okay? You go to work, you have to expand your sense of self and get along with co-workers and obey your employers or whatever it is. And so it is through life, our sense of self, our ability to relate expands. Swami Kriyananda, our founder of Ananda, and who is trained and commissioned directly by Paramhansa Yogananda, whose teachings we follow here. Gadzooks, in one sentence to the other, I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, in his landmark book on child education, speaking of children, called Education for Life, he gave a very interesting sentence. He said, maturity is the ability to include in your reality the realities of those around you. And in the whole book, there's nothing spiritual written at all, but basically maturity is spirituality. It's relating responsibly and authentically, compassionately, and wisely to the world around us, our karma, and so forth, as you say. One other book that he wrote that I think Morley mentioned last weekend was Sadhu Beware. And you may not see yourself as a wandering sadhu on the banks of the Ganges, but I'm not sure there are any anymore, but there might be a few. But we are all in our souls sadhus. We are wandering through the labyrinth of life, seeking many things, but ultimately seeking freedom, ultimately seeking peace, ultimately seeking happiness in a way that is not just temporary. And so he has a chapter in there, and he talks about being an ego detective, and it's so, I've often said before that to me the litmus test of of ego consciousness is the degree and the response that we have to real or imagined, mostly imagined I'd say, criticism from other people. The degree to which we self-justify our actions to people. And that's not easy, believe me. I mean, you don't need to believe me. I know you know. That becomes for each of us, though, a litmus test. How many people wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning suddenly churning over what somebody said or what we think they said or what we think they meant and so forth? That's a good indication of how self-involved we are, okay? But there's other things, you know. It's you know, wanting to be given approval and claiming credit. You had an idea and somebody else mentions it, and you want to say, but I had that idea too. That's one of my favorites because I do that a lot since I'm so smart and stuff. So, you know, there's certain things that I think we all know are pretty obvious. But the problem with any of that is that why do we want to be ego transcendent? What's the purpose of that? After all, the ego doesn't want to be transcendent. And so that's where the spiritual path really comes into. That's when the heart what we teach our children in our Living Wisdom School is when they misbehave or do things, the teachers try to get them to feel what it's like when you gossip. And a lot of times when people gossip, they sort of, or tell a dirty joke or something, they sort of try to laugh it off because it's unclean, and they try to, they know they're beyond where they shouldn't be. So when it's the heart that feels, anger pinches the heart, gossip pinches the heart. And so when we begin, and with meditation, we get more self-aware. And during the day, when we watch the breath in meditation, teaches us to observe ourselves and our behavior and our feelings. And the feeling of, it's really an unclean feeling when we judge other people, especially on mere appearances and behavior and so forth. What did Jesus say? If the dirt in your eye, before you judge somebody with the dirt in your eye, I forget what he said. You know what he said. Anyway, don't judge other people. So, but here's the thing. Well, I remember, what Buddha's first words were after his enlightenment? Somebody saw him and came up to him and said, "Who are you?" They could feel that there was something really powerful. And he said, "I am awake." And that's the process of life, even in a human way, to become awake, to become more aware. And for the most part, from the standpoint of the ego, becoming awake and aware means to have more possessions, to have more travel trips, to have more, relationships maybe, if that's your thing. Just, we want more things and experiences. But to the soul, that awake, it's feeling like last night I sent out an email to friends. I have a Facebook friend in Pakistan, and he's I think an Episcopal minister or something, real sweet guy. And I gave a talk to his youth group recently and over the phone, and his little flock of people, being Christians in Pakistan, they're not really popular, you can imagine, but they're good people and they respect other people. But their little flock has been ravaged by these floods. And at one time, he had to buy a child out from indentured, basically slavery, child that still happens there sometimes, making rugs and stuff. And anyway, so I asked some of my friends if you'd want to donate to him what he's doing. He had a little girl with an incredible thyroid issue, and the family couldn't afford the medication and so forth. So, it's expanding that sense of our own, who we are and what is, having that compassion for other people. And that's part of what's wonderful in the world today is we can see these things happening everywhere. Of course, it's frustrating because we can't do a lot about some of these terrible things that happen. but it certainly starts with a desire to feel. You know, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, the yogi, far from being non-attached and indifferent to the world, feels the joys and sorrows of all beings. That's what the process, the spiritual path and the process of yoga should take us. I think of Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita and the great Mahabharata. He went out to do, his conscience as a warrior was to fight the battle, and he was the greatest of the warriors, they said. And he went out in the battle, looked around and said, "Nah, never mind. I'm not having it. These are all my friends. Why should I?" And these friends are for us. You know, it's our conscience that calls us to awake. Our conscience calls us to be better, okay? And there's a part of our, so, you know, in our meditation classes, we say to people, quoting Yogananda say, "The soul loves to meditate." And then he'd pause, everybody'd smile, and then he'd pause and say, "But the ego hates to meditate." And so we say that in our classes to warn people where that resistance comes from. Well, it's the same about our own personal goodness, if you will, our own spiritual path. There's a part of us that resists, like Arjuna on the battlefield. So Krishna was kind enough not to beat the guy over the head. He talked to him for a while and convinced him that maybe that wasn't a good idea, to be a coward, not fight. But you know, the same thing happened to Moses. You know, Moses, you know the story about it being a child and sent down the river, and same thing as Krishna, of course, but anyway, or I think, never mind, I get my stories mixed up. But he was Jewish, he was an Israelite, and he was brought up in the Pharaoh's household. So, you know, like us and like the prince and the pauper, he was the pauper Israelite, but he was brought up in the royal settings. There's a part of ourselves, our soul, that knows its greatness, its immortality, its power, to use the affirmation here. But then his conscience called to him, and so he killed a man, an Egyptian who was beating to death an Israelite who were in slavery at that time. So his conscience called him to do that, but he had to run for his life and leave the land. And so he was out in somewhere, Ethiopia or somewhere south of Egypt, and hiding, basically. And he was a shepherd. He had remarried and stuff. And we all know the story about that burning bush. He's out there with the sheep or goats or something, and he sees this bush burning but not being consumed. So he gets, gee, that's really weird. And he comes closer. Well, what's the burning bush? The burning bush is our conscience. And of course it isn't consumed. If you listen to your conscience, it continues. I find, and I believe, and I think many of us have experienced, that you come into your teenage years and you know, feel your wild oats or whatever they are, and so your conscience sort of goes to sleep. I remember approaching high school. I always knew I'd do stuff like this, you know, and my father would drag me around and give talks to his Catholic men's groups and stuff. But I came to a point where I said, you know, I wasn't ready for that. And I think a lot of us go through that. Later on, many years later, when Swami Kriyananda wanted to ordain a batch of us as ministers, you know, we were reluctant. We didn't want the response, whatever, you know, you don't put it into words, it's sort of a visceral thing. And I think we all go through that like Arjuna. Moses said, hey, I don't want to go save those Israelites. I mean, he knew he was wanted for murder, for one thing. And, you know, he figured those Israelites weren't going to listen to him because he had been part of the Pharaoh's household, you know, sort of like a Trojan horse. And finally, God wouldn't give up. His conscience wouldn't let him go. And finally he said, but you know, he must have had a speech impediment, is apparently the interpretation. That's according to the story. But so his conscience, God, said to him, don't worry, your brother Aaron, he's a great speaker. You can tell him what to say. So he wouldn't let him off the hook. And that made me curious. I said, well, I think that's kind of the story of the soul, isn't it? And so sure enough, I went through the Old Testament and I looked up, like Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah. He said, I'm way too young. I can't, answer that call. And so it says in the Bible, the story is sort of charming. God says he put words in his mouth. And then there was, who was the other one? Well, Jonah, who got swallowed by the whale. You know why he got swallowed by the whale? Because he had that calling, if you will, that conscience. And he said, I don't want anything to do with it. So he ran away, took board on a ship to go to Spain. He wanted to get out of there. He didn't want to rescue the Israelites and be a prophet and stuff. And that's when he got swallowed by the whale. And so if you study the lives of great souls, you find that resistance, just as you and I have. Gideon, for example, Israel was being ravished by some nasty neighbors and stuff. So the Israelites were hiding out in the hills, and this guy Gideon was also quite young, and he wasn't very strong. And so when he got that inspiration to, unite the Israelites in opposition to these people who were ravaging their land, he said, there's no way I can do this. And so what he did is he prepared a sacrifice, a little altar, and he offered things. And then in the story, the angel of the Lord came and blessed the whole thing. But it's the truth that no matter, or as Swami Kriyananda put it, one time Padma said, Swamiji, we need a book for the 20-year celebration on communities. And Swami was just exhausted. He had been doing all sorts of things as usual. And he said, I can't do that. And then he thought a little later, he said, no, it's true. I can't do that, but God can. And then he wrote this incredible book. What's it called? Cities of Light? Yeah, Cities of Light, all about communities. And then, to test him, God pulled the plug. There was some electrician, and this is back in the PC days when if you didn't save your work, and he wasn't that good at his computer, and he hadn't saved his whole book, and some electrician came to do something with the batteries and pulled the plug, and everything he had written was lost. And he was just devastated. And then he sort of regained and looked up and rewrote the book in a new way. This is the story of life. It's not the ego that can do it. When we turn to the divine, when we turn to God, when we turn to the Guru, when we turn to that higher power that is the reality of life, we can do great things. Maybe not into the world. I mean, no, not everybody can be a prophet. But what is the great work we have to do? To become free. So, even the great prophet, I had one more to mention, Isaiah. He had all these visions. His very first vision of God was so incredible, and he was so unexpected to him. Obviously, he had some past life karma there, that in the midst of the vision, he said, but I'm so impure. And he, in the story, it's his lips. And so some angel picked up some burning something or other, charcoal, and purified his lips and gave him the power to do what he had to do. So when we turn within, when we pray for guidance, I find that even amongst many who are sincerely on the path, it's hard to ask. It's hard to, we want to do what the ego wants to do, what I want to do. And when Yogananda, when Yogananda came to his guru, Sri Yukteswar asked, well, will you give me your unconditional obedience? And Yogananda said, oh, yeah, you sure? I mean, just like the rest of us, he resisted, right? And he said, why? And Sri Yukteswar explained that when we first come on the spiritual path and we begin to get inspiration, we tend to have, and I have seen living in intentional communities most of my life, that this happens pretty much to everyone. We suddenly get these red hot, quote, spiritual ideas, and some of them are better than others. And it's hard to learn to stop and ask somebody who might have a little bit more experience than you whether your spiritual idea is really, truly inspired. Sometimes it has to do with travel, sometimes it has to do with a relationship, sometimes it has to do with health and so forth. Oftentimes we've seen in our lives, people like us are very sort of counterculture and alternative, and so over the years when people might get cancer, they would want to do it in a natural way. They'd go to Swami Kriyananda, and he never told people what to do. He didn't want that karma, but he would gently, because sometimes we're actually afraid. We don't want to go through chemotherapy, and who can blame us, or radiation, and so forth. And the fact, the preciousness of human life is to do the battle of life, to stay in the body so that you can continue your spiritual journey and serve and so forth. That is often, not always, but often the higher dharma. So a lot of times under the banner of being spiritual, we self-justify a lot of things, which is why we need one another to ask and talk about some of these great ideas that we have. I want to end now with one of my favorite quotes from the Bhagavad Gita. It's chapter 9, verse 22, in which Krishna says to Arjuna, "Those who meditate upon me, who give their hearts to me, I make good their deficiencies and render permanent their gains. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you." And I know in my life, with Padma and I and many others of my friends in Ananda worldwide, those of us who have had the opportunity, not everyone does, but at a young age, or any age really, to give our lives completely to the spiritual service and to the spiritual path, added unto such a one are satisfactions that go far beyond anything the ego can ever accomplish. The spiritual path is a path of faith. We each have a unique path to go, so what one does doesn't mean another needs to do. But in the essence, it's always the same: to answer the call of conscience, to answer the call of faith, to sit up in the morning and meditate, at night, and whatever it might be. We know what is right to do, and to have the strength to do what is needed and offer. That's why we bless our food. Food that is offered to God with the source of all goodness, even in a material way. To tithe and pledge, to offer that which we are in service and communion and so forth. We are blessed 100 times. This is the life of faith, and this is how the ego grows and finds the joy of the soul.
I'd like to read from Yogananda's Whispers from Eternity, the words that Hriman selected. Demand for seeing the one fire beneath all soul flames. O eternal fire, thou art the little soul flames rising through the burner of cosmic manifestation. Each human being is but one flame, separate seeming from all others, and also from thy universal source of power. Thou dost appear many, finite, limited, small or large, but ever divided, shooting up as separate entities through the pores of living organisms. But thou alone art that one eternal flame. All things other are but thy multifarious appearances. Om.